The Valley Current.
So imagine intentionally plunging your household into just massive, unprecedented debt.
Right.
Like you're completely draining the bank accounts you spent a decade building, and you're actively driving away your highest earning family members.
And, accumulating billions in angry lawsuits from everyone in the neighborhood while you're at it.
Exactly. But then when someone asks how you're doing, you point to a single number, say your incredibly low credit card balance, and you announce that your finances have literally never been stronger.
It's the ultimate case of macroeconomic cognitive dissonance, really.
It really is. Today, we are looking at a situation where the structural foundation of a house might be collapsing, even while the occupants are insisting that, the freshly painted walls prove everything is perfectly fine.
Yeah, it's a masterclass in the difference between a country's surface-level financial weather and its deep long-term economic climate.
Yeah.
We naturally crave simple metrics. We want to look at a single data point, like the value of a currency or the unemployment rate, and just declare an economy either victorious or doomed.
Mm-hmm. It's human nature to want that simplicity.
Exactly. But when you're looking at a sovereign state that is actively engaged in a massive war economy, those traditional metrics don't just lose their meaning.
They actively disguise the reality, right?
Yes. The smoke from the wartime furnace completely obscures the structural flames burning beneath the floorboards.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are taking a very close, highly detailed look at a really fascinating piece of source material today.
It's quite the document.
It is. It's titled The CLG Russia Financial Ruin Newsletter, July 2026. And it's authored by Jack Russo. He's the managing partner at Computer Law Group, LLP.
And he holds an MBA, a JD, and an LLM, so he brings the very specific multidisciplinary lens to this.
Yeah, exactly. This source gives us a unique perspective because it's not just looking at military strategy or pure politics. It is relentlessly focused on business, international law, and high-level geoeconomics.
And the central mystery we're unpacking here is really a question of structural integrity.
Right, like, are the cascading consequences of the Russian Federation's war against Ukraine producing genuine, inescapable financial ruin?
Or, conversely, are we witnessing a state that has engineered a way to endure severe, perhaps agonizing strain, but in a way that is ultimately survivable over the long haul?
Now, before we pull the thread on that, I really need to establish our ground rules for this deep dive. Our approach today is going to be strictly impartial.
Absolutely essential to point out.
Yeah, the source document we're analyzing is deliberately structured to present both sides of this argument. So, the case for absolute ruin and the case for remarkable resilience at their absolute maximum strength.
And we are doing the exact same thing.
Right. We are not taking sides. We are not here to validate or endorse the political viewpoints of any belligerent party, whether left-wing or right-wing, east or west.
We are just looking at the source material.
Exactly. Our mission is to objectively report on the verifiable economic numbers, the complex legal proceedings happening in international courts, and the specific claims made by the parties involved, just as the newsletter lays them out.
We're isolating the math, the demographics, and the legal mechanics.
So to navigate all that complexity, the author provides this really elegant conceptual framework.
Yeah, I love this framing. The premise is that the cost of a major war is never paid just once.
Right. It isn't a single invoice that just clears the treasury and you're done.
Exactly. A war is paid for 3 times across 3 entirely different timelines. So the first payment is immediate and highly visible. It's paid in ordnance.
The tanks, the artillery shells, the rubles wired to defense contractors.
Right. Then the second payment stretches over decades, and that one is paid in people. That's the demographic cost.
And the third payment?
The third payment, which is arguably the most insidious, the most permanent, and definitely the hardest to resolve, is paid in courtrooms. That is the legal ledger, and that can outlast the actual fighting by generations.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with that first payment, the immediate ledger. What is this conflict actually extracting in terms of raw currency and hardware right now?
Well, if you look at the numbers for the year 2025, the scale of the mobilization is just staggering.
Yeah, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, CPR, tracks this global data, right?
They do. And according to their metrics, Russia's defense budget hit $190 billion in 2025.
Wow.
Which equates to 7.5% of its entire gross domestic product.
I feel like we really need to pause on that 7.5% figure because without historical context, it's just a number to most people.
It is. So for a modern industrialized nation in peacetime, military spending typically hovers around 1.5 to 2% of GDP.
Okay, so 7.5 is massive. Even the United States, with its huge global footprint and dozens of overseas bases, usually sits somewhere in the mid 3% range, right?
Exactly. Hitting 7.5% means the entire architecture of the national economy has been fundamentally re-engineered to serve the military.
But it gets even more intense when you look at the internal composition of the Russian federal budget itself.
Yeah, this is where you really see the strain. If you take the outlays for national defense and you combine them with the budget for internal security, you find that roughly 38% of everything the federal government spends is being consumed by the security apparatus.
Nearly 40 cents of every single ruble the government spends is going to weapons, soldiers, or domestic policing.
It creates a massive crowding out effect.
Because every ruble spent on an artillery shell is a ruble not spent on, modernizing a hospital, building a high-speed rail line, or funding university research.
Right. But anyone monitoring the Russian Treasury announcements recently might push back here.
Oh, because of the 2026 budget?
Yes. In December 2025, when they signed the 2026 budget, they announced a nominal cut. They officially reduced the national defense line item down to 12.93 trillion rubles.
Right. So the official narrative there is that the peak spending has passed and they're scaling back.
That is the official narrative, yeah. But it relies heavily on accounting veils.
Accounting veil?
Yeah, when independent analysts look beneath the surface of that nominal cut, a very different picture emerges. The source cites work by Janis Klug, an analyst from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs.
What did he find?
Well, he scrutinized the actual localized treasury data for the first quarter of 2026. And rather than a decrease, the actual military outlays surged by 30% year over year.
Wait, a 30% surge? How does a modern government just hide a 30% surge in military spending from its own published budget?
By fundamentally changing the definition of what is public information. The report highlights that an unprecedented portion of the 2026 budget has simply been moved into the shadows.
Meaning it's classified.
Exactly. Roughly 84% of the national defense line item is now classified.
That's incredible.
And this isn't just about hiding the cost of specific classified weapons programs, which, all countries do. Yeah. This is a macroeconomic cloaking device.
Designed to obscure the true depth of the economic mobilization.
Right. It serves a dual purpose. It prevents the international community from accurately measuring the strain, and it shields the domestic population from realizing just how much of their collective wealth is being incinerated on the battlefield.
To give an idea of how much money might be hiding behind that classified veil, the newsletter actually cites an estimate from the BND, the German intelligence agency.
Right, and their numbers are telling.
They calculated that the true, unvarnished 2025 defense spending wasn't the official $190 billion. They estimate it was closer to 250 billion euros.
Which would push the burden up to around 10% of Russia's GDP.
Now, we do have to note that this is an intelligence agency estimate, a belligerent party claim, but it really illustrates the massive gap between the public ledger and the likely reality of the war economy.
It's a huge discrepancy.
Still, anyone looking at the global energy markets is going to spot a major caveat here.
The oil money.
Exactly. Russia is one of the world's premier exporters of hydrocarbons. They are still pulling millions of barrels of oil out of the ground every day. They entered this conflict sitting on a mountain of cash reserves. So even if they are burning 10% of their GDP on the military, why should they care? If the oil money keeps flowing, aren't they basically impervious to the cost?
Well, that brings us directly to the tension between the fiscal fortress concept and the reality of their rapidly draining savings account.
Okay, let's look at that savings account.
Right. So before the conflict escalated in early 2022, Russia's National Wealth Fund, the NWF, was the crown jewel of their economic defense strategy.
This is their sovereign wealth fund, right?
Yes. It's a massive rainy day account built explicitly from surplus oil and gas revenues over the years. In early 2022, the liquid assets in the NWF stood at $113.5 billion.
That was the fortress that was supposed to make them sanction-proof.
Exactly. But if you fast forward to April 2026, the liquid portion of that fund has plummeted to just $47.8 billion.
Oh, wow. That is a staggering evaporation of wealth. They've basically burned through nearly 2/3 of their liquid national savings in just 4 years.
They have. And that burn rate is happening alongside a broader structural cooling of their economic engine.
What do the numbers look like there?
The International Monetary Fund data indicates that Russia's GDP growth slowed drastically, dropping to a sluggish 0.6 to 1% window across 2025 and 2026.
I imagine the Kremlin spins that differently.
Of course. The Kremlin's official position frames this slowdown as a deliberate, expertly managed cooling of the economy designed to prevent runaway inflation.
But the internal projections from Russian financial institutions tell a much more anxious story, don't they?
They really do. The newsletter points to a 2026 warning issued by analysts at Gazprombank.
And Gazprombank modeled a specific scenario, right?
Yes, they modeled a scenario where global oil prices drop into the $30 to $35 per barrel range. If that happens, Gazprombank warned that the remaining liquid assets in the National Wealth Fund wouldn't just deplete slowly.
They could be completely exhausted in a single year.
Precisely, in 1 year.
And if the National Wealth Fund hits zero, that's the moment the government has to start making impossible choices, like between funding the front lines and paying pensions in the provinces.
Exactly. That is the core of the ruin argument.
But as we mentioned at the top, the source material is very disciplined about presenting the opposing argument at maximum strength as well. We have to look at the resilience case.
And honestly, the resilience case is formidable.
Let's start with sovereign debt, because that number surprised me. The amount of money the Russian government owes to creditors is hovering around 23% of their GDP.
From a purely mathematical standpoint, a 23% debt-to-GDP ratio is the envy of the industrialized world.
Right. To put that in perspective, the sovereign debt of the United States, the UK, or Japan is well over 100% of their respective GDPs.
Yeah. In a normal integrated global economy, a country with only 23% debt has immense borrowing headroom. They could walk into international bond markets and comfortably borrow hundreds of billions of dollars to finance their deficits.
But they aren't in a normal, integrated global economy.
Exactly the issue. The traditional borrowing window is completely nailed shut.
Because of the sanctions.
Right. Because of the sprawling sanctions regime, Western financial institutions cannot underwrite Russian sovereign debt. So while they have the theoretical capacity to borrow, they lack the practical access to the lenders who actually hold global capital.
But where the resilience truly shines is in their export architecture. They haven't just sat back and let sanctions strangle their oil trade.
No, they have engineered an entirely parallel global logistics network.
The newsletter details the rise of the shadow fleet. And by April 2026, this shadow fleet of tankers was responsible for carrying a record 54% of Russia's seaborne fossil fuel exports.
Over half their seaborne oil.
We really need to pull back the curtain on this shadow fleet because it sounds like something out of a spy novel, but it's a massive physical reality on the world's oceans. How does a country just conjure a shadow fleet capable of moving more than half of its oil?
Well, it requires exploiting the intricate, often opaque mechanisms of global maritime trade. You see, historically, the global oil trade was dominated by Western shipping companies and insured by Western syndicates.
Mostly based in London, right?
Yes, primarily the P&I Club's Protection and Indemnity Clubs based in London, which provide liability coverage for maritime disasters.
Right, okay.
So when the West imposed a price cap on Russian oil, they basically said, you can only use our ships and our insurance if you sell your oil below this specific price.
And Russia's countermove was to bypass that system entirely.
Precisely. They began acquiring aging tankers, often paying premium prices for them, using anonymous shell companies registered in jurisdictions with very loose oversight.
So these are the flags of convenience?
Exactly. A ship might be owned by a shell company in Dubai, managed by an operator in India, and fly the flag of Gabon or Panama.
And they hide where the oil is coming from.
Yes. To hide the origin of the oil, these ships frequently engage in spoofing.
Spoofing their location.
Yeah, they manipulate their automatic identification system so they appear to be in one location when they're actually somewhere else.
Oh, wow.
And they also conduct ship-to-ship transfers in the open ocean. A smaller Russian tanker will meet a massive shadow fleet vessel off the coast of Greece or, in the middle of the Atlantic, pump the oil across in international waters, and obscure the true origin of the cargo.
Okay, but what about the insurance? If one of these aging, anonymously owned tankers spills millions of gallons of crude oil in the Baltic Sea, who pays for the cleanup?
That is the geopolitical nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
The shadow fleet operates without standard Western P&I insurance.
So who insures them?
They rely on obscure, state-backed Russian insurers or alternative coverage from non-Western entities. And their ability to actually pay out a multi-billion-dollar environmental claim is highly questionable.
But from the perspective of Russian economic resilience, the shadow fleet is a triumph.
It absolutely is. It allows them to continue monetizing their primary resource, bypass the SWIFT banking system by settling trades in alternative currencies like the Chinese yuan or the Indian rupee, and keep the domestic economy afloat.
And this export revenue seems to be filtering down to the domestic population in unexpected ways, too. The newsletter cites polling data indicating that reported life satisfaction in Russia actually hit post-1993 highs during this period.
I know, it sounds crazy.
Which, yeah, when you're discussing a country engaged in a massively destructive war, feels entirely counterintuitive. Why would life satisfaction peak?
It basically comes down to the mechanics of labor scarcity. When a state mobilizes hundreds of thousands of working-age men for the military, and shifts hundreds of thousands more into round-the-clock shifts at defense plants, you suddenly have a massive vacuum in the civilian labor market.
So fewer workers available.
Right. Construction companies, logistics firms, retail sectors, they're all desperately competing for a shrinking pool of available workers.
And when demand outstrips supply,
wages are forced upward. For a significant segment of the blue-collar Russian workforce, they are experiencing real, tangible wage gains. They have more disposable income than they did before the war.
And it's an illusion of prosperity, isn't it? Because those wage gains aren't driven by increased productivity or technological innovation or a booming global export sector. They're driven by the fact that the workforce is literally disappearing.
Yes, it is the definition of an overheated, unsustainable dynamic. The government is injecting massive amounts of cash into the economy through military contracts and soldier salaries.
And that cash chases a limited supply of civilian goods.
Because the factories are busy building tanks, not washing machines. And that dries up inflation.
Right.
Then the central bank tries to crush that inflation with punishingly high interest rates, which strangles civilian business investment. It's a precarious, high-wire balancing act.
And on top of that balancing act, they are holding a massive financial hostage. Let's look at the hostage assets the newsletter details. We hear constantly about the West freezing Russian assets, but the resilience case points out that Russia has a counter-leverage mechanism built into the domestic economy.
They do. When Western corporations, energy giants, automotive manufacturers, retail conglomerates attempted to flee the Russian market in 2022, the Russian government didn't just let them pack up their factories and leave.
They trapped them.
They trapped those assets. The newsletter notes that Russia is effectively holding roughly $194 billion in Western corporate assets inside its borders.
$194 billion.
Yeah. They've constructed this Byzantine legal framework that makes it nearly impossible for a Western company to sell its Russian subsidiary and repatriate the cash.
So it's a shield.
A massive $194 billion shield against Western confiscation of Russian sovereign reserves. The implicit threat is clear. If you seize the Russian central bank money sitting in European vaults, we will immediately and legally expropriate the factories, the equipment, and the intellectual property of every Western company trapped inside Russia.
Okay, if we synthesize this entire first half, the classified budgets, the draining wealth fund, the shadow fleet, the trapped Western assets, it paints a picture of a system functioning under immense crushing pressure, but still functioning.
It is functioning, yeah.
It's like a family that took a massive pay cut, but they are determined to maintain their lavish lifestyle. To do it, they are aggressively draining their 401k. And because the traditional banks won't lend to them, they're relying on expensive, unorthodox neighborhood loan sharks.
That's a great analogy.
The lights are still on, the cars are still in the driveway. The system works flawlessly, right up until the exact microsecond the 401k hits zero.
It's a brilliant encapsulation of fiscal strain. But as the author points out, the purely financial ledger can always be manipulated, right?
The central bank can print more currency, a treasury can classify its budgets, a state can build a shadow fleet to smuggle oil. But there is a second ledger that is fundamentally immune to accounting tricks.
The human ledger.
Exactly. There is one resource that is strictly finite, cannot be printed, and cannot be replaced overnight, and that is human beings.
Which brings us to the most sobering part of the analysis, the demographic mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
The newsletter argues that this isn't a temporary strain. It is a permanent 50-year amortization schedule of national potential. And this demographic drain isn't just a single leak. It's three distinct, simultaneous flows of human capital bleeding out of the country.
Three massive wounds.
Right, you have the direct battlefield casualties, you have the massive wave of war-driven emigration, and you have an underlying structural population collapse that predates the war entirely.
We need to examine each of those flows, and we must be absolutely explicit regarding the casualty data. The numbers we are about to discuss are statistical estimates and claims, not verified counts by a neutral international body. The fog of war makes real-time demographic accounting incredibly difficult.
Exactly. However, independent Russian outlets like Mediazona and Meduza have developed a fascinating and grim statistical methodology to pierce that fog.
Because the Russian government classifies military deaths.
Right. So these organizations rely on a probate registry statistical method.
Wait, how does that actually work? How do you count casualties by looking at probate registries?
Well, it's a method of capturing excess mortality. When someone dies in Russia and they leave behind property, a car, or a bank account, their relatives must file an inheritance claim with the Federal Notary Chamber.
So there's a paper trail.
A very predictable paper trail. These records are centralized and, historically, quite predictable. Mediazona and Meduza look at the baseline rate of inheritance cases open for young men in the years prior to the war.
And then compare it to the current rate.
Yes. Then they look at the massive spike in inheritance cases open for that exact same demographic since 2022. By running complex algorithms to filter out baseline mortality, COVID-19 after effects, and other variables, they can mathematically estimate how many young men are missing from the population.
And what's the number?
Through the end of 2025, using this probate method, they estimated approximately 352,000 Russian military deaths.
352,000 deaths. And that only counts the dead. It doesn't count the permanently disabled, the amputees, or those with severe traumatic brain injuries who will never re-enter the workforce.
It doesn't.
And the source material notes that reporting attributed to Western official claims pushes the total casualty number, meaning killed and wounded, combined up to the 1 to 1.2 million range.
Whichever methodology you lean toward, you are looking at the catastrophic removal of the most physically capable segment of the male workforce.
And that is only the first flow. The second flow is the people who saw the mobilization coming or who fundamentally opposed the conflict and simply left. Emigration.
The newsletter cites estimates that up to 1 million people departed Russia in the first year of the conflict alone.
But it's not just the sheer volume of people, it's the specific demographic profile of who left. When a country experiences a mass exodus during a crisis, it is rarely the poorest or the least educated who manage to cross the borders.
No, it is the affluent, the highly educated, the people with internationally recognized skills, and the financial means to start over in a new country.
The brain drain.
Yes.
And the numbers here are incredibly specific. The Russian Digital Development Ministry itself officially acknowledged that roughly 100,000 IT specialists left the country in 2022.
But an independent academic panel study cited in the newsletter suggests the real number is much higher, estimating that among the émigrés in 22 and 23, there were about 344,000 IT specialists.
344,000.
If you are an economist looking at the long-term viability of a modern state, that number is absolutely terrifying. We are talking about a demographic cohort with an average age of 32.
Prime working years.
These are the software engineers, the data scientists, the cybersecurity experts, the systems architects. These are the people who build the digital infrastructure required to run modern logistics networks, banking systems, and advanced manufacturing.
And they're gone.
When 344,000 of them leave, they don't just take their current salaries with them. They take decades of future productivity, innovation, and intellectual property.
I really want you, the listener, to pause and visualize what this means on a practical level. Think about your own company. Think about the IT department that keeps your network secure, your servers running, and your data accessible. Now imagine if 10% or 20% of that entire department just vanished across the border in a single 12-month period.
It would be chaos.
Think about the institutional knowledge that walks out the door. Think about the complex projects that would instantly grind to a halt because the only person who understood the legacy code now lives in Dubai or Tbilisi.
Yeah.
It would paralyze a Fortune 500 company.
It would.
Now scale that paralysis up to the macroeconomic level of an entire nation.
It paralyzes future growth. And what makes this loss truly existential, what turns it into a 50-year demographic mortgage, is that these two massive wounds, casualties and emigration, are layered on top of a patient that was already suffering from chronic structural demographic decline.
This is the third flow, the pre-existing population collapse.
Yes. To maintain a stable population over time, without relying on mass immigration, a country needs a total fertility rate of 2.1 children per woman. That's the replacement rate.
And where is Russia's rate?
Russia's total fertility rate sits at roughly 1.4.
That's way below replacement.
It is a crisis that dates back to the massive economic dislocation following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, which caused a drastic drop in birth rates. Those missing children of the 90s are the ones who are currently in their late 20s and early 30s.
So there are simply fewer of them to begin with.
Exactly. And now, precisely when that small cohort is supposed to be entering their prime family-forming and most productive economic years, they are being fed into a war or fleeing across the borders.
The compounding math is brutal, because a 25-year-old software engineer who flees to another country doesn't just deprive Russia of his own labor, he deprives Russia of the children he would have had and the children they would have had. The newsletter points out that because of this confluence of factors, projections show the Russian population, which was around 146 million in 2022, dropping to the 130 to 135 million range by 2045 or 2050.
Which forces us to completely reevaluate a statistic we discussed earlier.
The unemployment rate.
Yes. We talked about how the Russian government points to their ultra-low 2.2% unemployment rate as a sign of incredible economic health.
Right.
In a peacetime economy, full employment usually means businesses are booming and everyone who wants a job has one. But through the lens of this demographic mortgage, the newsletter correctly diagnoses that 2.2% unemployment is not a metric of health.
It is a symptom of starvation.
It is a binding labor supply ceiling.
There's literally no one left to hire. If a factory owner wants to add a third shift to increase production, they can't. The workers simply do not exist.
Exactly. The economy hits a hard physical limit on its ability to grow. You can classify the defense budget, you can build a shadow fleet to sell oil, but you cannot artificially synthesize a 30-year-old systems engineer.
Right.
The demographic mortgage is amortized over 50 years, and the payments are extracted in the form of careers that are never begun, patents that are never filed, businesses that are never founded, and generations of children that are never born. The damage is permanent and irreversible.
Which brings us to the third and final ledger. We've talked about the immediate cost in ordnance and the permanent cost in people. Now we must examine the ledger that is actively unfolding in courtrooms around the world.
This is the centerpiece of the July 2026 newsletter.
The legal wall. The source argues that while demographics define the internal limits of Russia's future, international law is actively building a wall that will define its external limits.
And the legal landscape we're analyzing here isn't about war crimes or international criminal tribunals. This is strictly about money. We're looking at a cascading series of arbitral enforcement victories for expropriation claims.
Expropriation.
Right. In international law, when a state seizes property or assets that belong to a foreign investor or a foreign corporation without paying fair compensation, it's called expropriation. Over the course of 2025 and 2026, international tribunals have consistently ruled against the Russian Federation for these seizures.
And the dollar amounts attached to these judgments are astronomical.
Let's lay out the scale of these claims, because they dwarf the GDP of many small nations.
Okay, so you have the Yukos shareholders claim, which is a saga that has been playing out for 2 decades, finally resulting in an award for over $60 billion.
$60 billion.
You have Oshad Bank, the Ukrainian state bank, holding a roughly $1.1 billion award for assets seized in Crimea. You have energy companies like Stable and DTEC holding awards for over $252 million.
And hovering above all of these massive corporate claims is the Council of Europe's Register of Damage for Ukraine. By mid-2026, that register had logged around 150,000 individual and state claims.
It is a tidal wave of paper judgments. But a judgment from a tribunal in The Hague or a panel in Paris is only a piece of paper. It doesn't magically transfer money into your bank account.
No, it doesn't.
To turn that paper into actual currency, the creditor has to engage in enforcement proceeding.
Right. They have to go to a national court, say in the United States or the UK or France, and say, please legally recognize this international arbitration award so we can use your local law enforcement to seize Russian assets located inside your borders.
And the newsletter zeroes in on one highly specific anchor case to explain how this enforcement mechanism is suddenly accelerating. It is the case of the Ukrainian energy giant Naftogaz.
The Naftogaz case is crucial.
Naftogaz won a roughly $5 billion arbitration award against Russia, specifically for energy assets that were expropriated when Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014. They took that $5 billion paper judgment and brought it to a federal court in Washington, D.C., asking the U.S. justice system to enforce it against Russian assets located in America.
And on July 17, 2026, Judge John D. Bates issued a procedural ruling that the newsletter argues fundamentally alters the geopolitical landscape.
Why is this ruling so explosive?
To understand that, we have to look at Russia's traditional legal defense strategy. For decades, when faced with these massive international awards, Russia has relied on the weaponization of time.
Delay.
Exactly. If you owe a corporation $5 billion, your primary goal is to ensure you never have to write the check. Your secondary goal is to delay the enforcement for so long that the corporation goes bankrupt paying legal fees, or the political winds shift, or the creditor simply gives up out of exhaustion.
So in the Naftogaz case, Russia filed an appeal in the Netherlands asking the Dutch courts to completely set aside or invalidate the original arbitration award.
And then they went to Judge Bates in Washington, D.C. and said, Your Honor, you need to hit the pause button on the American enforcement proceedings. We are appealing this in Europe. The Dutch courts might throw the whole thing out.
It would be a waste of your court's time to start seizing assets here when the underlying judgment might be erased over there. So, grant us a stay. Let's just wait and see what happens in the Netherlands.
And from a purely administrative standpoint, that argument sounds highly logical. It is standard practice in many cross-border disputes to wait for the primary jurisdiction to resolve appeals.
But Judge Bates didn't do that.
No, he flatly denied the request to pause. He refused to stay the U.S. proceedings. And his written reasoning establishes what the newsletter refers to as the decoupling principle.
The decoupling principle. What exactly did he decouple?
He decoupled the timeline of the U.S. enforcement track from the timeline of the European appeal track. Judge Bates ruled that the existence of set-aside proceedings in a foreign court, the Dutch appeal, has absolutely no bearing on the U.S. court's jurisdiction to hear the enforcement case. He relied on the framework of the New York Convention, which is the foundational international treaty governing arbitral awards. Under that convention, a U.S. court has a nearly mandatory duty to enforce a valid international award unless very specific, narrow exceptions are met.
So he just looked at their request to wait.
He characterized their hope that the Dutch court would moot the case as mere speculation and declare that mere speculation is not a sufficient legal reason to delay justice for the creditor.
The strategic implications of that are massive, because if a sovereign state's entire defensive posture relies on maximizing the time cost for their creditors, stretching a 5-year process into a 20-year war of legal attrition, Judge Bates just stripped them of that weapon.
He effectively told the Russian legal teams, your European appeals don't matter in my courtroom. We are moving forward right now.
It neutralizes delay as a strategic shield.
Exactly. Now, as impartial analysts, we must accurately report Russia's legal counter-arguments. Their defense teams are not just throwing up procedural roadblocks. They make substantive arguments regarding jurisdiction and international law. They maintain that the original arbitral tribunals fundamentally lacked jurisdiction because the bilateral investment treaties did not explicitly cover investments in the territory of Crimea under these circumstances.
Okay.
Furthermore, they argue that the entire Western regime of freezing and immobilizing sovereign central bank assets violates established norms of state immunity under international law.
That is the legal battlefield.
Yeah.
But anyone listening to this, anyone who has ever been owed money by someone who refuses to pay, is probably thinking the same thing I am. So what does this actually mean in the physical world?
Yeah.
We have Naftogaz clutching a $5 billion judgment from 2023. You have a U.S. judge in 2026 saying, go ahead and enforce it, but is there actually any money to seize? Can Naftogaz literally collect $5 billion? Or is this just a phenomenally expensive thought experiment taking place in a federal courthouse?
It is the absolute opposite of an abstract thought experiment. Those legal rulings are the starting guns for a frantic, ruthless, real-world scramble to seize physical assets.
The newsletter gets really interesting here with game theory.
It does. It transitions us into the most fascinating economic theory in the newsletter. The author applies game theory to explain the behavior of these massive creditors, describing the global enforcement landscape as a multiplayer game trapped in a state of Nash disequilibrium.
Nash disequilibrium. Let's translate the graduate level economics into practical terms. What does it actually mean when a global legal system falls into disequilibrium?
We have to start with the baseline. In game theory, a Nash equilibrium, named after the mathematician John Nash, is a state of stability. It's a situation in a multiplayer game where no individual player has any incentive to change their strategy, as long as the other players keep their strategies unchanged.
So everyone has found their optimal position based on what everyone else is doing.
Right. Nash disequilibrium is the mirror opposite. It is a state of systemic cascading instability. The incentives in the system are actively punishing patience and actively rewarding chaotic, hyper-competitive, aggressive behavior.
And the primary engine driving this instability in our scenario is something called the common pool creditor race.
Which comes down to basic scarcity. There are hundreds of billions of dollars worth of paper judgments out there. Yukos alone hold over 60 billion. Naftogaz has 5 billion.
But the actual pool of Russian state and corporate assets sitting in Western jurisdictions that are legally attachable, meaning assets that don't have absolute sovereign immunity protecting them, is incredibly small and finite.
It is an environment of extreme scarcity. Imagine you are the CEO of Yukos, and you have been fighting in international courts for 2 decades to collect your $60 billion.
Okay.
You suddenly see Naftogaz, who just won their award in 2023, marching into a U.S. court and getting permission from Judge Bates to start hunting for assets. Because the pool of attachable assets in the U.S. is so small, if Naftogaz finds a frozen bank account, a real estate holding, or a corporate subsidiary, they will seize it.
And once they seize it, it's gone.
Gone. It cannot be seized by Yukos.
So the dominant strategy for every single creditor is raw speed.
Exactly. The rational, optimal strategy for any individual creditor is to front-run everyone else. You have to locate the asset, file the attachment order, and liquidate it before the other 150,000 claimants even know it exists.
It is an individually rational sprint because every CEO has a fiduciary duty to maximize recovery for their own shareholders, but it creates a collectively disastrous stampede.
Instead of a coordinated, orderly liquidation of assets, you have hundreds of highly paid legal teams suing each other, racing to the same courthouses, and fighting over the same scraps of capital.
And what's incredible is that Judge Bates, sitting in his courtroom in Washington, D.C., explicitly recognized this exact economic dynamic in his ruling.
He did.
He didn't just deny the delay on procedural grounds, he denied it on economic grounds. He wrote that forcing Naftogaz to wait would fundamentally threaten their ability to ever recover the money, because while they waited, other creditors could swoop in and deplete the exact same American-held assets.
It's like watching a giant piñata hanging in the middle of a room.
Yes. The piñata analogy is surprisingly apt for sovereign asset attachment.
Let's flesh that out.
Well, think about the dynamics of the room. The piñata is the incredibly scarce pool of attachable Russian assets. Surrounding the piñata are all these massive corporations, Yukos, Naftogaz, Ashudbank. The sticks they are holding are their multi-billion-dollar arbitral awards.
Right.
Before Judge Bates issued his ruling, everyone was sort of standing in a circle, politely arguing with the referees about the rules of the game, waiting for their turn to swing. But Judge Bates just handed Naftogaz a megaphone, and they announced to the entire room that the piñata is about to be cracked open right now.
The polite waiting game completely evaporates.
Suddenly, every single person in the room drops the rule book, lunges forward, and starts swinging their sticks wildly at the exact same time. The danger isn't just that the candy will run out. The danger is that in the chaos of the stampede, the creditors end up bashing each other instead of the target.
That captures the Nash disequilibrium perfectly. It is intra-creditor warfare. But here is the massive geopolitical complication that the newsletter highlights. The biggest piñata in the room isn't hanging in a courthouse in Washington, D.C.
It isn't in the United States at all?
No, it is sitting in Europe. And this introduces what the source calls the G7 coordination problem.
We are talking about the motherlode of frozen assets. There is roughly 210 billion euros of Russian central bank reserves currently immobilized in the European Union.
210 billion.
And the vast majority of that, nearly 190 billion euros, isn't even spread out across the continent. It is concentrated in a single location, a financial services and clearinghouse company called Euroclear, which is headquartered in Brussels, Belgium.
To understand the paralysis surrounding this money, we have to understand what Euroclear actually does. It is a central securities depository.
Mm-hmm.
When the Russian central bank was building its massive fiscal fortress before the war, they didn't just stack gold bars in a vault in Moscow.
They bought bonds.
They bought European government bonds, sovereign debt, and securities. And those assets were cleared and held through Euroclear. When the war escalated, the EU legally immobilized those assets, Russia cannot sell the bonds, and they cannot withdraw the cash.
But the money is still there, and the bonds are still maturing and generating billions of euros in interest payments every year. I mean, 210 billion euros is enough to completely recapitalize the entire Ukrainian economy, rebuild the power grid, and pay off massive chunks of the arbitral awards. So if all these Western governments are united in their support for Ukraine, and the money is just sitting there in Brussels, why don't they just pass a law, confiscate the 210 billion euros, and hand it out?
Because of the asymmetry of risk. This is the heart of the G7 coordination problem. If the G7 coalition, the US, UK, Canada, Japan, and the major European powers, makes a collective political decision to legally seize those assets and change ownership, the moral and political victory belongs to the coalition.
But the risk?
The legal and financial retaliation will fall almost entirely on Belgium.
Because Euroclear is a Belgian entity governed by Belgian law.
Exactly. If Euroclear transfers those funds, Russia won't sue the Western coalition in a vague, abstract sense. They will relentlessly target Euroclear. In fact, Russia has already launched massive mirror litigation in Moscow courts, aiming to seize any Western assets held within Russia's own clearing systems as direct retaliation against Euroclear.
Oh, wow. So they're already retaliating.
Furthermore, seizing central bank reserves violates the historic international norm of sovereign immunity. If Belgium breaks that norm, other nations, say China or Saudi Arabia, might view Euroclear as an unsafe jurisdiction and pull their own trillions of dollars out of the European financial system.
So the risk is concentrated entirely on one small European nation, while the geopolitical reward is distributed globally. It is an excruciatingly difficult collective action problem to solve.
The author of the newsletter, Jack Russo, distills this incredibly complex geopolitical standoff into a psychological and organizational framework he calls the 7 quotients.
I found this really interesting.
He frames the entire financial war not just as a clash of tanks or treasuries, but as a battle of these quotients. On one side, you have the Russian Federation relying on its AQ, its adversity quotient.
Their AQ.
This is their historical demonstrated capacity to endure agonizing economic strain, absorb punishment, adapt to sanctions through shadow fleets, and simply outlast the pressure.
And arrayed against that adversity quotient, you have the Western coalition, whose success depends entirely on their PQ and their CQ, their persistence quotient, and their collaboration quotient.
The newsletter argues that the entire outcome of this financial war hinges on a psychological test. Can a diverse, squabbling coalition of Western democracies maintain the multi-year persistence and the intricate legal collaboration required to untangle the Euroclear problem? Or will their collaboration fracture under the weight of domestic politics, allowing Russia's sheer endurance to win out?
Which leads us to the ultimate question. We have a scenario where hundreds of billions of dollars are legally owed. We have a stampede of aggressive creditors armed with U.S. court rulings. And we have 210 billion euros locked in a diplomatic and legal purgatory in Belgium because of a collective action problem.
Has a situation this incredibly tangled ever been resolved in the history of global finance?
The newsletter dedicates its final analysis to history's ledger to find the answer.
And history provides a very cold, unambiguous lesson regarding sovereign debt derived from conflict. Sovereign states almost never pay massive judgments voluntarily. The concept of consent does not apply here.
So you can't just ask nicely.
No. A hostile nation does not simply receive an invoice from a foreign tribunal and write a check out of a sense of moral obligation. Sovereigns only pay when the payment mechanism is automatic, entirely out of their control, and the funds are pre-secured by the victors. The newsletter walks through 3 distinct historical precedents to illustrate how this actually plays out.
Let's examine those precedents. The first one is the classic cautionary tale of international finance, the aftermath of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles.
Versailles is the ultimate example of how not to extract reparations. The victorious Allied powers imposed a staggering, politically motivated quantum of debt onto Germany. But crucially, they relied on the German state to voluntarily generate the revenue internally and hand it over.
They demanded the money, but they didn't control the mechanism of payment.
And the result was catastrophic. The German government, faced with impossible demands, essentially destroyed its own currency to try and cope. It led to hyperinflation, the complete collapse of the Weimar Republic's economy, mass radicalization, and directly paved the way for World War II.
The historical lesson is that if you impose a massive legal or political debt without securing a captive funding mechanism, you don't get your money. You just get chaos and a sequel to the war.
Exactly. Now contrast that failure with the second precedent, the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal.
Okay, what happened there?
This was established in 1981 following the Iranian hostage crisis. American corporations and citizens had billions of dollars in claims against a new revolutionary government in Iran for expropriated property and broken contracts. In this instance, the judgments were actually paid out because the United States didn't ask Iran to voluntarily send a check. During the crisis, the U.S. had frozen massive amounts of Iranian state assets held in Western banks. As part of the Algiers Accords that ended the crisis, a specific escrowed security account was established at a central bank in the Netherlands, funded directly from those previously frozen Iranian assets.
So the money was already locked in the vault.
When a tribunal ruled in favor of an American company, the money was paid directly out of that escrow account. The sovereign had no ability to stop the transfer.
The funds were pre-secured. But the third precedent is perhaps the most relevant model for the current crisis, because it deals with how to extract payments from an ongoing flow of revenue rather than a static frozen bank account.
Right.
The newsletter points to the United Nations Compensation Commission, the UNCC, which was created after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990.
The UNCC is the gold standard for automated sovereign extraction. After Iraq was expelled from Kuwait, the UN Security Council passed resolutions making Iraq legally liable for the massive environmental and economic damage caused by the invasion. But rather than handing Saddam Hussein a bill, the UN created a structural choke point.
Under the Oil for Food program?
Yes. An automatic levy was placed on all of Iraq's legal oil exports.
How did they enforce that? If a country buys Iraqi oil, how does the UN make sure they get a cut?
By controlling the international banking pathway. Buyers of Iraqi oil didn't wire money to a bank in Baghdad. They were legally required to wire the payments into a specific escrow account controlled by the UN, held at a bank in New York or Paris.
Wow.
The UNCC automatically took its cut, initially 30% of all revenues, which was later reduced to 3% to allow the Iraqi civilian economy to function, and then passed the remainder to Iraq for approved humanitarian purchases.
And it worked.
Through this automated, inescapable mechanism, the UNCC processed 2.7 million claims over 3 decades and successfully paid out $52.4 billion, which represented about 15% of the total claimed amounts. It worked because the payment was tied directly to a commodity export that the sovereign couldn't hide, and the mechanism was entirely outside their sovereign control.
When you apply the lessons of Versailles, Iran, and the UNCC to the Russian situation today, a very clear defining reality emerges. The ultimate determinant of whether Russia faces genuine structural financial ruin isn't going to be decided on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. It's not going to be decided by the inflation rate in Moscow supermarkets or the nominal size of the defense budget.
No, it's not.
It is going to be decided entirely by whether the Western coalition can summon the persistence quotient and the collaboration quotient required to build a UNCC-style mechanism around that €210 billion frozen bank account in Belgium.
That is the crux of the newsletter's entire geopolitical analysis. Everything else is secondary to the fate of those immobilized reserves. The source lays out 3 potential scenarios for how this legal and financial standoff resolves over a 5-year horizon.
Scenario A is the UNCC-style resolution.
Yes. In this scenario, the G7 and the European Union overcome their coordination problem. They find a legally viable mechanism to either confiscate the principal, €210 billion, or to collateralize the massive interest payments generated by those funds, and they channel that money to Ukraine and to the international creditors.
If this mechanism is successfully built, Russia's long-run financial position deteriorates decisively.
The paper judgments held by Yukos and Naftogaz are converted into hard currency drawn directly from Russian wealth. The ruin thesis is substantially realized, and the newsletter judges this to be the most likely scenario over a 5-year horizon, given the current trajectory of Western treaty-making and political rhetoric.
Okay, but what if the politicians flinch? That brings us to scenario B, frozen but unused.
This is the scenario where the legal risk to Belgium and the fear of undermining the euro as a global reserve currency paralyze the coalition. The assets remain safely frozen at Euroclear. Russia can't touch them, but the West refuses to confiscate them.
So what happens to the creditors?
In this world, creditors like Naftogaz continue to win their court cases, and Judge Bates continues to issue enforcement orders, but there's very little actual cash available to seize because the central bank reserves remain legally untouchable. The financial ruin stays latent.
Russia's resilience case holds up regarding their day-to-day cash flow.
But that massive, multi-hundred-billion-dollar wall of legal judgments hangs over their economy forever, compounding with penalty interest, acting as a permanent toxic lien against their sovereign future.
And finally, there is Scenario C, the settlement unwind.
Historically, a settlement unwind is the most common outcome of major conflicts. The fighting stops, a grand diplomatic peace treaty is signed, relations are normalized, the frozen assets are unfrozen and returned to the sovereign, and the creditor's claims are essentially wiped out or settled for pennies on the dollar by political decree.
However, the newsletter argues that this is structurally the hardest outcome to achieve in the current crisis. Why is a traditional peace settlement harder now than it was in the past?
Because the independent legal architectures that have been built, the arbitral awards granted to Yukos or Naftogaz, the 150,000 claims logged in the Council of Europe's Register of Damage, the enforcement rulings issued by independent federal judges like John D. Bates, these exist in a legal realm entirely separate from executive diplomacy. The law does not magically expire just because politicians shake hands and sign a piece of paper. A U.S. president or a European prime minister cannot simply order an independent judiciary to erase a $60 billion corporate judgment. Undoing the legal wall would require a level of domestic and international legal engineering that is almost unfathomable.
The courtroom ledger outlasts the ordnance ledger.
Always.
It's a profound, almost dizzying irony to realize where the true leverage lies. We spent the first half of this deep dive exploring the visceral realities of war astronomical artillery budgets, massive shadow fleets navigating the globe, the tragedy of 350,000 statistical casualties, and the irreplaceable loss of hundreds of thousands of young professionals fleeing across borders.
And
yet, the ultimate determinant of structural, inescapable financial ruin hinges almost entirely on a collective action decision made by a group of bureaucrats and politicians regarding a digital ledger entry sitting on a server in a clearinghouse in Brussels.
It highlights a fundamental truth about how modern conflict has evolved. Warfare is now fought on multiple simultaneous planes. The kinetic war destroys the present reality on the ground. The demographic war hollows out the future potential of the nation for 50 years. But it is the legal and geoeconomic war, the courtrooms, the clearinghouses, and the enforcement mechanisms that will permanently dictate the terms of survival for generations to come. As we wrap up this deep dive, we have to synthesize what we've unpacked from this incredible source material. The immediate military spending is astronomical, heavily classified, and masking severe underlying economic strain.
The bleeding of human capital is a permanent, irreversible mortgage on the nation's future.
But true structural ruin, the kind of financial devastation that permanently collapses a state's ability to operate in the global economy, remains a contingent political outcome. It is waiting on a singular decision by the West regarding those immobilized assets. And while the politicians deliberate, that legal wall is only growing taller and thicker. Judge Bates's ruling in the Naftogaz case is just one procedural brick in that wall, but it is a foundational one.
By decoupling U.S. enforcement from foreign appeals, he sent a clear signal to every creditor on the planet that the U.S. courts are open for business, and the great stampede for assets is officially underway.
It really is.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought. This is a provocative question that builds directly on the reflection and discussion section of the source material, but we haven't touched on it yet.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
We talked extensively about the tangible financial ledgers, the ordnance, the central bank reserves, the corporate claims. We also talked about the 50-year demographic mortgage. But here's something complex to chew on. If human capital loss is truly the most severe, most permanent, and most economically devastating cost of this conflict, how would a global reparations tribunal ever actually price it?
How do you even begin to calculate that?
Exactly. When the dust eventually settles and international courts are tallying the final comprehensive bill for the destruction, should long horizon human capital loss enter into a legal reparations valuation? How do you put a verifiable dollar amount on a lost generation of innovation or calculate the financial damages for a generation that never even happened?
It's the most haunting and perhaps the most important question left unresolved on the entire ledger.
It really is. It challenges the very limits of what international law can measure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And as promised, we need to let you know exactly where this incredible source material came from so you can explore these concepts further yourself. Led by Jack Russo, Computer Law Group LLP is a bespoke business litigation and founder-friendly boutique law firm with offices and licensed attorneys in Silicon Valley, New York, and Tampa Bay. And you can reach Jack at computerlaw.com and his team at www.computerlaw.com, where the newsletter we refer to is published in detail and readily available, commitment-free with no paywalls or other charges.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.